Matt DeCourcy is the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration. Erin O'Toole is the Conservative critic for Foreign Affairs. And Nathan Cullen is the NDP's critic for Democratic Reform. They join me for the last time from the House foyer. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you there. Yeah, really appreciate you guys making time. Mr. DeCourcy, I'll start with you. Can you update us? We just heard Katie give what, her understanding of the latest information has any contact with either of these gentlemen being made by the government?
Well, Vassy, Global Affairs is certainly aware of where these two individuals are within China. Due to privacy considerations, I'm not at liberty to disclose where they are, but the minister has spoken with both the families. Our officials are providing consular services, as we always do. I mean, these are humans that we're talking about, and we always take the strongest considerations and give our best effort when we have Canadians who are detained abroad. And Canadians at home can rest assured that in this case, our officials are providing the best assistance that they possibly can, and that our minister is speaking with counterparts to ensure that they are treated well. So
just to be clear, and I take your point, the Foreign Affairs Minister has spoken with her counterpart in China?
We're speaking with officials around the world, and our officials are certainly working to get consular access to those individuals.
But they don't have it yet.
Country. Again, privacy considerations being what they are, I'm not really at liberty to disclose exactly what the interactions are, but Global Affairs and all our officials are working feverishly to ensure that these people are provided with the consular service that we owe them. And we've been in touch with the families as well to offer that consular service to them.
Mr. O'Toole, the Conservative Party's leader, Mr. Andrew Scheer, said today that the Prime Minister's, quote, naive approach to relations with China, he called it a policy of appeasement, has led in some part to Canada having no leverage in this situation. Can you expand on that? Does your party feel that the Prime Minister is really responsible for these men being detained?
Well, the Prime Minister has had a very strange approach with respect to China. It was his priority on a foreign policy basis to have a free trade agreement, and we remember the almost silly comments about his admiration for the basic dictatorship. But then his trip that was supposed to launch the free trade discussions didn't go well. They weren't even allowed to take photographs with Chinese leadership at the end. And now it's clear, Mr. DeCourcy, whenever they have privacy concerns, that means he didn't want to answer your question. They have not been in touch with the two Canadians on the ground. And it sounds like the minister has not spoken directly with her counterpart. Andrew Scheer has asked the Prime Minister to get in touch with Chinese leadership personally and intervene, because this is clearly a tit for tat in relation to the detention in Canada of a Huawei official. It went from one senior former diplomat for Canada now to two Canadians. So the Prime Minister needs to take charge on this directly and realize that this tit for tat cannot continue, or they should warn Canadians about travel to China.
And I'll ask Mr. DeCourcy about the Prime Minister's involvement, but I just want to be clear, because, I mean, this is retaliation from everything we've been led to believe from China for the arrest of Meng Wanzhou. That arrest is something that happened outside of the political process. Are you trying to allege, is your party trying to allege that isn't the case?
This is clearly a retaliation. We haven't been able to hear from the government in terms of what the Canadians on the ground are saying the reasons they were detained were. There was one detention, then we learn of another one. We're not even sure where they are. So it's clearly...
So you think it's the Prime Minister's fault, though? That's what I just don't get. If it's in retaliation for those arrests, that was outside of the political process. That's something that happened in the legal system.
The extradition clearly had political ramifications, Vassy, because it took place on a weekend, and Canadians didn't learn until it was leaked to the Globe and Mail several days later, and the Prime Minister acknowledged he knew about the extradition before the arrest was made. So certainly there are political overtones to this.
Does that mean political interference or overtones?
Overtones for sure. Certainly in Washington, Canada is seen as very weak on Chinese relations. The Norsat sale of a Canadian company with Pentagon contracts still gets talked about in the U.S. That led to U.S. thinking we were a weak entry point for Chinese technologies, these sorts of things. So I think the Prime Minister's playing catch-up in terms of how the Five Eyes allies look at China. And now we're in a situation where I think he has to personally intervene to make sure that there's not more Canadians detained in this tit-for-tat war.
Mr. Cullen, do you think that there is a political aspect to all of this, I guess?
Well, I mean, we're stuck between these two trading global giants who are fighting with each other on a constant off and on basis with Mr. Trump in the office, who really, I think the extradition treaty, let's start there, that there were concerns about Huawei and the CFO of Huawei, this woman in particular, having breached an embargo in deals with Iran. We were asked as a country to perform an extradition hearing to potentially bring her charges in the US on those allegations, and Canada is a rule of law. I believe the country had to respect that. Now, Mr. Trump has made that incredibly difficult by suggesting this isn't just about the courts and the rule of law. He's inserted himself into say, well, if China gets better on trade, maybe we'll forgive the charges against this CFO of this Chinese company. That makes it incredibly difficult for Mr. Trudeau to be able to say this is entirely in the courts when Trump is alleging that there's politics involved. Now, the retaliation that China is now taking by arresting Canadians in China, and we see the op-eds and we see the attacks against us as a country, worry me greatly, because it becomes some sort of, I want to use the term carefully, but prisoner exchange, where they say, well, if you let her go, this Chinese business official, then we'll let your Canadians go. And the fact that we haven't made contact through consular affairs worries me greatly and worries those families. And the privacy stuff, we've had Canadians taken before, and when we make contact, the Canadian government tells us that. And when we don't, the Canadian government tells us that too. I just, with all respect to Matt, I know he has a point of view to deliver, but that worries me that I don't think we've made contact with these Canadians who are now potentially, pawns in this very, very intense game of chess at the global level.
Mr. DeCourcy, does Mr. O'Toole have a point? Should the Prime Minister himself be intervening right now?
Like I said, our consular officials are dealing with the case of these two individuals who are detained in China. It's frivolous for the opposition to suggest that there has been political motivation to this. No one has made that link whatsoever.
But there are still two people being detained. Should the Prime Minister
and they are serious considerations, and there are mechanisms and steps through which our officials take careful consideration to make sure that consular services can be provided to the individuals as well as their families, and Canadians across the country can rest assured that our professional officials are doing everything that they can to provide the appropriate services to these individuals.
But look, Mr. DeCourcy, I remember a time when Mohamed Fahmy was detained, and your party was incredibly critical of the Conservatives at the time because Mr. Harper himself didn't make the call. Is there, at which point does the Prime Minister intervene then, if he hasn't already?
Well, again, I'm not going to speak about things that I'm not at liberty to speak about, other than to stress for Canadians that the consular services are our utmost priority, and are looking after these two individuals who are in China as well as their families is always the primary consideration for the Government of Canada in these delicate situations.
Mr. O'Toole, go ahead.
This is the concern we've had for some time, Vashi. Chinese state-owned enterprises are arms of the Chinese state. So you can see that China feels that a detention of an executive with Huawei is like a detention of one of their diplomatic officials. They almost want diplomatic immunity. At the same time, they try and suggest that they're a corporation just like any other corporation.
To be fair, Mr. O'Toole, when your party was in government, you let a state-owned corporation buy an oil company in Alberta, though.
Absolutely, because there were no direct security considerations at play. With the Norsat transaction, there were Pentagon contracts. The pressure we put on the Aecon deal because of strategic infrastructure in British Columbia, dams and nuclear refurbishments in my riding in Durham. This is the issue, is we need to engage in trade, but the state-owned enterprises themselves, we have to view as extensions of the Chinese state. And clearly the Chinese, the ambassador, I've said this to him personally, they are not crown corporations. Their senior executives have to be members of the Communist Party, and this is leading to this blurring of the lines between where does the Chinese state end and where do their corporations end. And I think now we're seeing Canadian civilians drawn into it. That's why we'd like to see the Prime Minister take charge.
Mr. Cullen, do you think the Prime Minister needs to intervene like the Conservatives do?
Well, one of the concerns is that this keeps accelerating and getting worse and worse. Like, I guess, can we imagine waking up tomorrow and hearing the news of another Canadian being detained by the Chinese without us having any access or knowledge of where they are? And Canada, I know the government is considering a travel advisory for the country of China. I guess there's some tragic irony in this, as China has pretended to be and portrayed itself on the world stage as a place where you can and must do business. But the way that they're demonstrating how politics and business in their mind mix with these very strong accusations against the Canadian government for performing an extradition treaty hearing and a charge that has been brought by one of our allies raises those concerns, because at the end of the day, Huawei is under great concern by the US, the UK, Australia, and others, saying if you're going to buy into this technology and embed it in your infrastructure, there are privacy and, in some cases, military concerns about this. And the Liberal government to this point has so desperately wanted to get into the trade talks with China. They've been much, much more reticent than many of our allies in the democratic world at
They've shown restraint, though. They've shown restraint too, though. They're not.
To
they're not to, well, to Huawei. They're reviewing it. They're reviewing it. There's the official line is there's a review underway. They haven't said yes for 100%.
Yeah, but given their track record in terms of the permissibility when dealing with China, one doesn't have a lot of hope. So that at the end of the day, we're dealing with a very large and ambitious power in China who does not, it appears, from this case at least, respect our rules and our rule of law when it comes to something like an extradition treaty. Yet on the other side of the coin, I have some sympathy for Mr. Trudeau, because he's got Donald Trump, who's clearly politicizing in his comments, opposing the comments that the ambassador to Canada made just a few days or a few hours before, I think it was. Mr. Trump said it's political, his ambassador said it's not, and now Canada's stuck in the middle, and a lot of our businesses are quite concerned. I'm concerned for the long term, and I'm definitely concerned for these two people that have been taken, who may be just collateral damage in this exchange between the U.S. and China.
But what I would
really
say,
quickly,
Vassy,
Mr. Kursi, because I'm out of time.
What I would say, if there is concern, genuine concern for these two individuals, I would ask the opposition parties to allow our consular officials to do the good work that they do and do the good work they do with their families to make sure that we can provide them with the services that they need and that we can resolve the situation.
You don't even know where these folks are.
We support that. We want to see it escalated to the PM.
All right, we're out of time, but thank you so much to all three of you for joining us. As I said, for the last time from the House Foyer, thanks to Matt DeCourcy, Erin O'Toole, and Nathan Cullen. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Vassy.
All the best.